Thank you for joining us at today's session. It is unlikely to have escaped your attention that geopolitical competition is everywhere. We've seen rising nationalism, most notably with PPE and the struggle for vaccines. Sanctions have become an increasing tool of political and economic coercion. Sovereign defaults are up, and global anger and frustration has spilled over, notably thinking about Hong Kong or Chile or the US or Paris. Now, many of these events have been heightened by COVID-19, but a move away from global integration towards populism, protectionism, and the promotion of national champions was well underway before COVID struck. Now, some of you may have seen the on-demand video, Geopolitics and the Pandemic and Risks and Opportunities for Trade, recorded by Sam Wilkin, Director of Political Risk Analytics at Willis Towers Watson. For those of you that haven't had a chance to do so, I would encourage you to do so. But it does highlight opportunities and the risks that we all currently face. Global Britain is an opportunity to trade widely and deeply with new international partners, and part of this involves the well-publicised pivot towards Indo-Pacific. However, with all new relationships comes new challenges, new learnings and new risks. Taking the Indo-Pacific example, depending on where you draw those boundaries, Indo-Pacific, there's potentially 24 countries ranging from S&P AAA to B-. Now they include parliamentary democracies, constitutional monarchies and military dictatorships. So forging ahead isn't straightforward, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all model. But joining me today to discuss some of these risks, what companies should think about when investing in or trading with emerging markets, what mitigation strategies might there be to deal with some of these challenges, we have assembled a fantastic panel. We have in the studio, we have Toby Vass, Chief Underwriting Officer, Political Risks and Credit from Chubb Global Markets. We have Claire Simpson, Global Claims Director, Financial Solutions, Willis Towers Watson, and joining via sunny Glasgow, we have Ian Ladd, who is Group Treasurer and Director of Risk and Insurance at greco. So thank you for joining me today. So what I might do, Ian, I might start with you first, if I may. greco has a well-established global footprint and protocols that run off that. Other companies will just be starting that journey to look internationally at where they may want to invest or who they may want to trade with. So when looking overseas into new jurisdictions, in your opinion, what should companies be looking for? How do they measure that risk? And what would you advise them to do?
Well, everybody, that's an interesting question. greco, for those of you who don't know, provides power and other energy services, usually at quite short notice, to people who are somehow suffering a blackout of some kind. And so we operate in about 100 countries, not all at the same time, about 80 at any one time. And we're regularly in and out of these countries trying to help deal with power deficits. And so we really think about trying to look after three things. First of all, we want to look after our people, make sure that they're going to be able to go in and come back out again safely. We want to look after our cash, make sure that we can get paid and get the money out. We want to look after our equipment. So we have a fairly well-established process, which I'm sure those companies that work internationally will share, which requires input from our security function, our health and safety function, our operations function, finance, commercial, insurance teams, into a white paper that goes up before the board that says it's all going to be okay. And these are the things that we're worried about. This is the return. These are the exit plans. And we think it's all a good idea. Do you agree? But that is a fairly well-trodden path. And in amongst it are many of the things that you've just been talking about. Political risk figures pretty significantly. And we try to put countries into bands based upon their political risk using third-party information like control risks, independent country risk ratings, although I think other risk ratings are available, Stuart.
Excellent, thank you, Ian. Toby, we'll bring you at this point, if I may. In your experience, does this ring true? How important is it to understand what can go wrong and have protocols in place to try and manage these risks?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's very important to understand the risks you face as a company operating internationally, especially in emerging markets. I mean, if you haven't identified and assessed the risks you face, then you can't really expect to manage them. So, that's always the first step. And obviously the risks that a given company face are going to be very specific to it. It's not just about the country, it's about the sector you're in, and the country you're coming from. I mean, in say China, the risks that are faced by an iconic US brand are going to be very different from the risks faced by a German widget manufacturer that's sort of operating very under the radar, so to speak. Similarly, a Chinese mining company in sub-Saharan Africa is going to be facing a very different set of potential political risks to a South African food manufacturer operating in the same place. So, for us as underwriters, we obviously very much look to understand the risks that are specific to our clients and our insureds that they face, but we expect them to be analysing those risks themselves as well, because obviously they're at the forefront of managing those risks ultimately. I think it's important to note that objectively speaking, over the 20 years that I've been involved in this business, I think it's fair to think that political risks faced by companies operating globally have increased. Over the past sort of going back 70 years, it's been a sort of unusually stable time almost in a sort of world historical context. And, notwithstanding, through the Cold War and some of the events of the sort of first decades of this century centered on the Middle East and stuff, generally speaking, it's been quite a stable picture driven by, the sort of US sort of unipolar world post-Cold War, etc. We've all know and have focused on and analysed the sort of shift in the economic centre eastwards and southwards over the past decades. But I think we're sort of seeing an acceleration of the impacts of that. We've all known it's been happening, we've known it coming, but it's really now that we're seeing some of the impact of that in terms of the shift of the norms that we can expect to dictate how international commerce and international politics really work. And that's what people are really, meaning when they talk about geopolitics changing. It's that, the board that we're playing on is changing. So, in that context, there's just an inherent greater opportunity for volatility to exist. I think whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, the assumptions that we have about the things that are going to keep those countries, the external factors that have brought a degree of stability to those places maybe over the past 30 years, some of those are not necessarily in play anymore. We can't assume that the outside world is going to support stability in these places in the way that it has. Those dynamics are changing. So for companies that are operating in these places, I think there needs to be a great awareness that countries could maybe change a lot more rapidly than maybe their received wisdom was that they could in the past.
No, that makes perfect sense. So, I mean, this seems like quite a good time for maybe to Claire to get you involved in this.
The harbinger of doom.
No, exactly. So putting your claims hat on. So Toby's touched on a few points there, notably increased volatility and sort of the shifting sands of stability. So, I mean, what losses have you seen, particularly over the last 12 months or so? And kind of as an add-on to that, the losses of today are going to be different to the losses of yesterday, and we would expect the losses of tomorrow will be different still. So what learnings can we take away from those? What went well, what didn't? What should people think about now going into these new markets?
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Well, claims activity is up, and it's up across our whole portfolio. So non-payment risks, political risks and political violence risks. So probably the best thing I can do is give you a whistle-stop tour of the sorts of things that I'm looking at. If I look first at non-payment, then I would look at the sovereign type risks that we're facing and we're seeing come through in claims. And for me, sub-Saharan Africa dominates the agenda for that and has done really for the last 5 years. And I would suggest that 60% of all of our credit and political risk losses have come from there. Now, I think that Zambia's default is well known, but it's not just Zambia. We're seeing a plethora of risks in sub-Saharan Africa proving challenging for our lending and our corporate-based clients. So what are we seeing there? We're seeing Ministry of Finance risks go wrong, but we're also seeing state-owned enterprises default. We've seen a number of failures in the oil and gas sector. We're also seeing issues that companies are facing in terms of accessing hard currency. So that's the sort of sovereign universe. If I look at credit very, very briefly, because it's a big subject, I think we swing eastwards and we're seeing an increase in defaults coming in from Asia. It's harder to pinpoint industries or sectors, but if I was going to draw two things in the credit space that we're seeing as challenging, I would see that there's an increase in fraud at borrower level, which is starting to permeate through into the claims that we're seeing. And I would also see that we're seeing a lag effect of some of the supply chain disruptions of 2020 coming into roost now with credit losses. Looking more broadly to political risk, that's always a harder one to pin down because you never quite know where the losses are going to come from. And we've seen losses in the Middle East, we've seen things happening in Latin America. We're watching a couple of things in Asia at the moment, Myanmar in particular. So it can come from very left of field. We've seen forced abandonment type issues. We've seen confiscatory acts affecting our client base. And we've also seen countries giving companies problems in terms of accessing export licenses. So that's quite interesting. Political violence is a new one to me. That's only come under my bailiwick really in the last 2 years. And I think hitherto there hasn't been that much loss activity, but we're starting to see that really start to motor, not just in the hotspots that I've mentioned of Hong Kong and Chile, but also closer to home. We're seeing things happening in Europe and America start to drive loss activity as well. So that for me is an interesting one. In terms of looking at learnings, political violence is a newish class, not that much loss activity as I've already mentioned. So how those wordings perform over time is an interesting one. And we need to make sure as a market, I think, that we have our customers firmly and in the front of our minds and they have a positive claims experience. That said, when claims activity is up, my main focus is on the scarcity of resource risk. So are there going to be enough loss adjusters to do the job justice? Will the claims staff at the underwriters have enough resource to do it? And I'm pleased to report that even though activity is up and up quite markedly, the market is performing, Stuart, really, really well.
Fantastic, thank you. And just picking up on something, so do a little follow-up question. You mentioned fraud in Asia, and maybe just for everyone's benefit, as people are looking to kind of move down those chains. Are we looking at kind of overstating financials? Is that what we mean by fraud?
So, yes, so mismanagement. So yes, overstatement of revenues and understatement of debt has been a really interesting one.
Okay, so that's definitely something to look out for. Toby, from an underwriting perspective, I mean, are you seeing similar sorts of things?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of recent claims activity, it's certainly been focused on the credit and non-payment side of things. I mean, obviously, the impact of COVID last year had a dramatic effect on certain industries and sectors, and that's undoubtedly fed through into claims activity. I mean, the thing that we're very wary of is the fact that it probably hasn't ended up being as bad as a lot of people might have thought this time last year. But a big reason for that is obviously a lot of the government support that has been thrown at ensuring that economies globally don't fall off a cliff. And ultimately, that's been manifested itself in certain specific government support packages, support companies through things like furlough, but also a lot of debt being made available, and ultimately that's going to have to be repaid or restructured at some point. And so it's good that things maybe haven't manifested as terribly or as quickly as they could, but we're very conscious of cans having been kicked down the road in many ways, both on the sort of sovereign debt perspective and at the corporate credit level. So that's something we definitely focus on. Don't see a reason to be blasé about credit risk going forward, as I say, whether government or private. As I touched on earlier, from the political risk standpoint, we need to be very cognizant of the latent things related to geopolitical and economic shifts in power and demographic issues that haven't gone away. The world hasn't been very focused on them recently, but they haven't gone away, and that could certainly bring issues on the political side coming forward.
Yeah, and I think it's absolutely right. I think governments are distracted and looking elsewhere, aren't they? But it's an interesting observation that there are lots of problems in the hopper. They're kind of in the departure lounge before they get on the plane. So definitely one to watch. And I want to pick that up with you guys a little bit later. But I just want to come back to Ian, if I may. So I think we're clear that there is risk out there, and it's going to get increasingly bad over the short term and the medium term. How does a company address which risks they should be concerned about? How do you determine risk tolerance and your risk appetite? Because they're obviously key. And what are the key critical activities that might prevent a political risk from an greco perspective?
This is a really interesting area. And both Toby and Claire have talked a little bit about how different companies might face different risk scenarios. And there's no doubt about that. So the challenge is whether you can reduce all of that to some kind of stable framework that you can start thinking about and collecting data around. And we think we've done that at greco. I think it's a novel approach. I don't know anybody else has done it, but we have decided there are only 25 things that can go wrong. There are lots of different ways in which those things might go wrong, but there are only 25 events. So if you imagine yourself having to explain to your chief executive, what the disaster has been, at the end of the conversation, he's going to say, so what you're telling me is somebody's been involved in a security incident. Or what you're telling me is the premises are inaccessible. Or what you're telling me is that we've lost some financial assets. Or the equipment is lost. Or the contract's gone wrong. So at that level, we think there are 25 things that could go wrong. And so based on that Nobel Prize winning set of 25, we've been able to say, well, if those are the things that can go wrong, then what might stop them? What might mitigate the consequences if they do go wrong? And we can then build our expectations about how much we're exposed to those things going wrong, each one of the 25, and have a look at the number. So we have to be able to quantify it, and that means being able to have a yardstick which we can use to measure different kinds of risk, which we've also developed. And once we can see the number, we hope that that will tell us that the risk that the risk event we have to worry about at the most is the one at the top of the list, and the one that we have to worry about the least is at the bottom. And we use those numbers in that model to decide how much of each particular risk we want to take. Some of it we want to avoid altogether. We don't want to hurt anybody. Some of it we might be prepared to take. We're perfectly happy to take the risk that contracts might go wrong if we think that the returns are right. We wouldn't have the same appetite for hurting people, obviously. So that's how we try and do it. Stuart.
No, thank you very much. So, Toby, if we look at the rule of 25, as we're going to call it from now on, and in the mantra, but it's clear that companies should have a risk appreciation and an understanding of the risks they're going into. From an underwriting perspective, what characteristics do you look for in an insured, and what structural features? If people are engaging in negotiations now, what should they try and put in place that may protect them in the future?
I mean, obviously, again, that's going to be very specific to individual investors and the type of investment they're looking at. I mean, as a general rule, we're always going to be looking to work with people that either have a sort of proven sufficient quality experience of operating in the types of markets they're in. So they've sort of shown they can navigate the intricacies of working in a potentially difficult economic and political landscape and everything that comes with operating in emerging markets. If maybe they don't have that experience, then we'd certainly look to see evidence that they've done the due diligence necessary to be sort of diving into that world, right? Rather than looking for an insurance as an alternative to doing that due diligence and getting comfortable themselves. So that's always important. We also want to be working with people who are, long-term, strategically involved in this business, rather than somebody maybe looking to make a quick buck in a foreign country. That's typically not going to be something that's going to be attractive to us, for the reasons that ultimately we're looking for. to get involved in insuring things that are beneficial to the country of risk, to the host country that the investment is made into. If it's not something that's benefiting the people locally, it's probably not going to have local support, and that's where you start to see problems come across the various spectrum of types of perils that we cover. So I mean, understanding those things is important for our insured. It's important for us. Another thing we're always going to look very carefully at is what is within the control of our insured. It's all very well building a great new, whether it's a water plant, some kind of petrochemical complex, or even something much more basic, a factory. But if the success of that project is dependent on the government doing something, building a power grid connection or something, do you have control of that? And if you don't, then is that a risk we potentially need to be concerned at down the way? So, we want to be working with companies that are analysing their sort of, operating environment and the dependencies they have on the local government and government entities, because ultimately problems on that side of things can, bring problems for us down the road. Once we've looked at the risks that a company faces, we want to understand the mitigants that are in place. Whether from a legal perspective, is the company, investing in a way that brings protection under a bilateral investment treaty because of the country they're investing in and the country they're investing from, a nice backstop protection to have. Do they have agreements with the host country that gives them recourse if certain political risk events come into play? Physical security, as Ian mentioned, very important for the employees on the ground, but important for us given some of the risks we would typically cover on a political risk policy. All of those mitigants are things we're going to look at to understand the ultimate risk that we're potentially taking on as an insurer, and how it could be mitigated.
Thank you, Toby. I heard a really interesting expression today. It was talking, as we go to air today, there's been a big spike in COVID cases in South Africa. And one of the ministers was talking about public fatigue. So the idea that, people can only be locked down for so long, and you're going to start to get this spike in that frustration. So Claire, maybe again with that claims hat on, there's a body of thought which suggests that this populist trend is going to be with us for some time. That inherent frustration and aggression is going to kind of keep on going. It's going to be a groundswell. Do you think we're going to go back to the more benign days of geopolitical risks, or do you think these things are here to stay? And have we seen the kind of the peak losses, or do we think there's more to come? And I get the feeling from the earlier discussion there's more to come, but am I right?
I think there's plenty in the hopper. So back to benign days, no, not anytime soon, I don't think. If I look at our own portfolio, our 2020 figures were up 10% in terms of loss activity on 2019, and we're nearly at the half year, aren't we? I think we can say half year now. And half year 2021, we are already at par with the volume of claims that we faced in 2020. So 2021 is already considerably up. So that gives you a sort of flavour on the credit and political risk side of the sort of volumes that we're seeing. On the political violence side, albeit from much lower base, that activity is up fivefold just at the half year point on 2020. So I think activity's up. Why do I think it's up? I think the market is of a critical size now, that the attritional loss is here with us to stay on a year in, year out basis, where maybe in the past underwriters might have got away with very light loss activity years. That's going to be with us. And so what underwriters are gearing now for is the sort of catastrophe type event, the accumulation of risks. And I think that is coming. I think that's coming for a number of reasons, and the trajectory is such that will grow. And I think the pandemic, the losses are only really just starting. We haven't seen it. We didn't see the surge that we were anticipating last year, even though we saw growth. I think what we're going to see going forwards, countries have really got themselves into quite a lot of debt, and that's going to create some potential fragility in the system going forwards. I think there could be crises down the pipeline without being melodramatic, but I can see certain countries, I can certainly see places in Africa starting to suffer some more. And I think that debt's going to have to get paid for at some point. And so I can see austerity measures coming into play. And when people are starting to feel impoverished or it's starting to affect the man on the street more, one can see that that would lead to further increased escalation of political violence type perils. And I see that against the backdrop of the environmental issues and the social justice issues, which are still commonplace. So that's quite a heady mix, I think, that's going to lead to things keeping going. I think Toby's already touched on it, but as the sort of government support packages start to taper, and I know it's happening in the UK very imminently, I also see increased insolvency risk for corporates as well. So you set that against a backdrop of increased sanctions, contracting issues, licensing issues, potential resource nationalism. I realise that I have a day job that lends me naturally to be quite pessimistic, but I do genuinely see that the trajectory is for the world to stay complex and potentially over the next coming years become increasingly so. And having been an underwriter during the global financial crisis, I suppose my one takeaway from that is that when something seismic happens, it takes a considerable period of time for the loss activity to wash out through the insurance market. So yeah, I'm sorry. I think it's going to be busy for a while to come.
Okay, I know I picked up on the subtle undertones of that one. Okay, good to know.
Sorry.
I'm going to take a slight pause, actually. This is obviously a live event, and we're lucky to have some questions coming in live. For those of you who are watching this on demand over the next couple of days, who would have thought England would have beaten Germany 5-0? So let's see. Look, we have now. There was a question here a second ago about the US administration and sanctions. The questions actually disappeared from the screen, but one of the questions was going to be about what is the impact of the US administration when it comes to the sanctions landscape? What are the knock-on implications for the insurance market? And I'm just going to put a little bit of context in, which allows Toby a minute to think about the answer. But sanctions have increased. They've doubled over the last 10 years or so. And I think one of the reasons the US administration, it was the previous administration and this one, there's been a reluctance to put boots on the ground and to have troops in different locations. And smart sanctions is from an administration point of view, it's a very good way to try and coerce people into doing things. And one of the side effects is you can get a smart sanction that is targeted and focused on one particular group, but actually people often over comply, which means it has much wider implications. But as you say, then there's and it's building up, and other people are kind of jumping on those as well. So Toby, hopefully that's given you enough time to formulate your thoughts. But sanctions landscape, I mean, what do we think the implications will be for the insurance market?
I mean, yeah, as you say, there's definitely more sanctions activity than there was in the past. It seems to have become a preferred tool of certain governments. And I think it's sort of because of that increase in use, we obviously focus on it maybe more than we didn't, and we focus on it in slightly different ways. As you know, our insurance products, we've effectively always covered certain types of sanctions as an insured peril. Right? Export restrictions and embargoes, license cancellations as a result of government sanctions being put in place. This is something that the market has always covered on contract frustration pre-shipment policies, covering the inability to ship goods as a result of those sanctions, and on investment insurance products, covering investments where they're unable to export or import goods as a result of sanctions and embargoes. That's obviously a sort of fairly extreme manifestation of sanctions, but it's always been something that we've focused on as a market and underwritten. I think what's changed now is the extent to which we focus on these things, both in terms of our own compliance, because we don't want to end up insuring a transaction that falls foul of sanctions, and so that's why you see a lot of language put in policy wordings, designed to protect both us and our insureds against falling foul of sanctions language, or sanctions legislation. But the other thing I think that's become an increased area of focus for is the potential impact on credit risks we take on from sanctions. Because they're used so much more widely, if you're looking at taking risk on obligors, whether government obligors or private obligors, that do a lot of business in certain jurisdictions or are from certain jurisdictions that could be seen as at high risk of sanctions. I mean, this is a very significant credit risk to those companies' ability to operate and be creditworthy in the future. So that's something we focus on much more than we used to because of the prevalence of the sanctions activity.
Thank you, Toby. And Ian, don't think you can get away just because you're not in the same room. I'm going to put this. I'm going to put this over to you now. Obviously, sanctions is something that Greco will look at. Is this higher on the list of things that you look at now than it may have been a few years ago? Has there been a shift to look at this in knowing how quickly sanctions can be deployed and the impacts they can have?
It's always been right at the top of the list for Greco for a couple of reasons. I mean, one of them is just where we work and how rapidly changing some of those environments might be. But the other one is that we occasionally contract with the armed forces to take equipment so that they can power up their operations, and it doesn't really help you in bidding for those contracts if you've been on the sanctions breaches list. So we've never really wanted to be on that list. We've always taken it very seriously, but we are having to deal with it more and more in ever increasing numbers of jurisdictions, and that affects the way that we contract, the way that we finance things, it is becoming much more volatile, and I think the change events are what catch you out. And so you might go into a particular country thinking that the sky is blue, and then all of a sudden you discover that it's raining pretty hard. You might be too late and not able to get out of there before you get quite wet. So that's a real, I think, difference between managing that area now and managing it maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Was the frequency of change events. Okay,
no, thank you. It's a really good point. You've got to keep an eye on the landscape as well. We've had another question that's come in, but I'm going to come back to you in a second because it's is there a political risk playbook for large multinational corporations like a Greco? But before we get to that, there was always a danger of assumed knowledge in all these events. So Toby, I'm going to put it over to you. Political risk does cover a wide range of issues. Can you give us an overview of what the product is and what trends are you seeing in the marketplace at the moment? And then I might hand it over to you, Ian, to kind of get the Greco perception.
So big question, short amount of time. Political risk insurance is a broad range of products that's available to a variety of types of insureds. So I won't go into any granular detail. I mean, ultimately, it's there to protect assets and revenues that are in or deriving from emerging markets against certain named political perils that occur. The main ones being expropriatory and discriminatory type actions by foreign governments, political violence, whether that's causing physical damage or leading to abandonment of assets and business interruption following those events, currency inconvertibility, to the inability to get currency out of the country you're operating in, and also a range of perils related to breach of contract by government entities. It's a huge area. Obviously, we could talk about any of those specific perils in a lot of detail, but the key thing to note is that it's, these are insurance policies that are named peril insurance policies. So whilst we can negotiate and discuss the scope of those, they are covering specific things. And in some senses, the broader, term political risk obviously includes risks and things that could come to bear that are not necessarily covered by a political risk insurance policy. So for any insured, it's important to understand what is covered by the policy and also understand that they face risks operating in a country that are, broadly speaking, probably political risk, but they're not necessarily something that can or should be covered by an insurance policy. So knowledge is important in that area. In terms of trends, over the past years, we've seen a large increase in the amount of what we call multi-country equity. So that's insuring multinational companies for their investments that they have in their subsidiaries around the world. That's a book of business that's always been core to us. It was pretty static, really, for between sort of 2005 to 2015. Every year we'd write some new business in that space. Every year we'd see policies disappear as a result of sort of budgetary pressure on insurance budgets. Ultimately, political risk insurance for most corporate buyers is a discretionary product. So, we would see policies lapse and we'd put new policies on. What's really happened in the last 5 years or so is that nobody is letting political risk insurance policies lapse. I think it would be a brave, risk management department in the current geopolitical environment that we've discussed to do that. So we're just sort of constantly building that book. It's just getting bigger at the moment. Another trend is we've seen an increasing demand from non-bank financial institutions and private equity firms. Historically, they were not really a big type of insured in our area. It was dominated by multinational companies and international banks. Now there's a large amount of our book is made up of non-bank financial institutions and private equity. I think as a result of those entities becoming bigger in their own right, but also they typically invest in the type of projects and areas that have a natural affinity with political risk insurance, often in emerging markets, often infrastructure, often backed up by agreements with governments, whether it's a power purchase agreement or, but they're things that are quite, I don't want to say easy, but a political risk insurance policy works quite well wrapping around that. So yeah, those are the sort of main trends we've probably been seeing on the demand front recently.
No, so it's a wide area, isn't it? There's a big universe to think about. I'm going to move it back over to you now, Ian, for that question about the kind of a Greco playbook. What mitigation strategies do you look at, and what works well in the event that there is a problem?
It's a good question. We have got a book which is an approach. Whether it is the best one or whether it's shared by other people, I don't know. But the way we start is by looking at the things that we insure around the world. We insure our property, we insure our equipment, and if we look at the exclusions, they quite often don't cover all eventualities, in particular the ones that Toby's just outlined, that we would worry about in some places, but not so much in others. So we've got equipment at the moment in Japan waiting to power the Olympics. We're not really worried that somebody is going to expropriate that, to take it from us. We're not really worried that we might have to abandon it because there could be circumstances where it's too dangerous for it to be there. We're not very worried about terrorism there, and we're not very worried about war there. So we would say, okay, we don't need to buy anything else, we just use a normal equipment insurance and property insurance for Japan. But if that equipment went to Myanmar, which it perfectly could, then we would say, well, are we happy with these exclusions? Probably not. We might want to buy some cover for the gaps that we find in our normal insurance. And we would have to then decide how catastrophic an event would have to be for us to really feel sufficient pain to want to make some kind of recovery in that event. And so we might be prepared to take some loss before the insurance kicked in. And so the amount of equipment we've got in various different places comes into play there. So there is a playbook. Whether it's a winning one or not, you'd have to ask Claire, who deals with all the losses. What do you think? No, we haven't had very many. So it does seem to work at the moment.
Neatly segued to Claire. Look at that. Perfect.
That was beautifully done. Well done, Ian. Thank you.
No, please.
No, I was just going to do a riposte. You carry on.
Okay. There's something you mentioned earlier is about understanding how the policies will react. So I think it's a really key point to make that not all insurance policies are equal. These are bespoke policies, often that are put together at the at the request of a client. So what are the important things for companies to look for if they decide to once you've understood the risk and you want to work out how you manage it and they want to mitigate it into the insurance market? What are the key things a client needs to look for?
Gosh, that is huge, isn't it? I think Ian's touched on that already, because it will depend on where the company is active and the sort of the nature of the risks per country. But if I was going to start, I think the first thing, and Toby's touched on it already as well, is about policy clarity. It is named perils, the things that we deal with. So be really careful and considered in your approach. Talk to your advisors, your broker, shameless plug, about what it is you're concerned about to make sure that the policy does pick that up. I suppose the key thing as well is don't wait until the country's risk is deteriorating to make that purchase, because obviously that will make getting an insurance policy in place exponentially harder. I suppose the second thing that I would advise is for the policy to be kept live, not just popped away in a risk manager's drawer and forgotten about. I think we've seen a few instances recently where claims have been notified to us late, and it's not because of an error on the risk manager's part. It's more been because the policy hasn't been socialised, and the colleagues operating in Myanmar or somewhere else might not know what the policy's terms and conditions are or know what the obligations are. So keep that policy live. Make sure that people in these far-flung territories are aware of what the obligations are under the policy, and shout early if anything starts to go wrong, because in my experience of claims, the more you talk to your insurers and your broker, and the more that the stream of communication is an open one, it's a positive thing. So I would go with that. Communication is fundamentally key. In terms of the policy itself, because we span everything from non-payment through political risk to political violence, it's hard to draw any sort of policy specific things because it's almost too big a subject to touch upon, and we could do it for hours. But as a claims person, I would wholly advocate for having a really good claims clause in your policies where possible, because that lays out the expectations of who has to do what, to whom and when. And I think that's a really good thing. And if we had Tim Bradford here as a loss adjuster, he'd also be advocating for having template proofs of loss and release forms, because again, that goes to make the claims process as easy as it can be in what is a stressful time for the client. So they're my little pearls of wisdom, and I hope I've given you some degree of comfort that the insurance market actually is ready for what's coming, because it is going to be a pretty challenging time.
Ian, just coming back to you, so we've only got a couple of minutes left. Would you agree with Claire because I know you did a lot of work on your insurance policy when it was put in place? What areas did you really focus on?
The best thing we did was to go into the room with our broker and the lead insurer and read the policy together and just compare notes on what we thought it meant. And we came to the conclusion that quite a lot of it was indecipherable, really, and nobody had a clue what it meant. But fairly quickly, we agreed what it should say and went through together and rewrote it. Some of the key things, like when has a claim occurred, what you have to do, as Claire was just saying, when a claim has occurred, we just made it absolutely clear so that everybody knew. And that was a very, very helpful process, which clearly hadn't been done before. And everybody was surprised that it was ambiguous or that it was conflicting. And after the end of that, we felt that we knew what was going on and that it would meet our expectations if something went wrong. All the parties felt that. So that's what I recommend.
Excellent. So it's engagement with insurers and the brokers. And Toby, does that sound about right to you?
I mean, I'd hope that a lot of the policies we have wouldn't be seen as indecipherable or openly confusing. But I mean, it's a good point. I mean, one of the things that we do have to accept and recognise is the area that we're in is a relatively niche area compared to certain types of insurance. I mean, certain types of insurance have massively higher claims volumes than ours, so there's massively higher, precedent of testing clauses, what they all mean. I mean, obviously we have claims activity in our area, but just because of that fact, there is probably greater scope for that. And as we've said, you're dealing with on a name peril basis. It's important that all sides of the chain, the underwriter, the insured, and the broker, are on the same page of what is covered and what isn't covered. Very important.
Absolutely. Ian, I think we have a hand in the air.
Very, very quickly, just to come back to Toby, I think what had happened to our policy was that it was probably perfectly coherent when we signed it. And then, lots of willing hands had made small amendments to it to incorporate extra features and make changes as legislation changed. And after about 10 years of that, then there was a collective muddying of the original clarity, I think.
Yeah. And that is actually a classic problem. We've seen it where, you'll see an amendment made to an insured peril because someone wants to sort of broaden what that's covering. You know, it's something that was originally limited to covering the sort of net investment of an insured's equity. You know, that's then changed, broadened to cover certain other specific types of asset. But maybe the, you know, quantum of loss clause and the, you know, subrogation rights clause, you know, they aren't all then, not everything is changed to match that. So, you know, again, drafting is very important.
No, that's key. That's key. And I'm mindful we're running a little bit low. Well, we've run out of time. So apologies if we haven't got to your questions yet. But maybe just kind of summing up, I think volatility is here. It's here to stay. The stability we've been used to for the last 20, 50, 70 years or so, you know, that has changed. There is a shift in power. And I think it's just really key when people are looking to engage overseas or looking to move into new trading relationships, you need to understand what those risks are. It's absolutely critical to understand what your risk tolerance may be. What are you concerned about? Is it about losing assets? Is it about licenses? Is it about cash flow? Because once you understand that, you can then go to working out how you can actually mitigate those risks. So work out what you want to hold, what you want to keep. And if you've decided you don't want to keep a particular risk, you need to find a way to transfer that. Then if you look down the insurance market, it's a very wide and deep insurance market. It's absolutely, it's crystal clear that you need to understand what it is you're buying, make sure you're clear what it's buying, make sure you can articulate that within the organization so you can socialize it internally, just to make sure that we can head off any problems in the future. But I think that's it. We're out of time. Ian in sunny Glasgow, thank you very much for your time. Toby and Claire, thank you very much as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.